we're recording. We're here with Dr. Monzo. How are you doing today, Dr. Monzo?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You have a nice little profile picture. It's a deer with a cross crucifix in the like within the antlers of the deer. Is that stolen from somewhere? Did you come up with that yourself?
Um, it's it's the icon or like symbol of it's called like the Saint Hubert stag. But I found this out recently because I don't know if you know who Duncan Rayburn is. He's another substacker in these spaces, but he did the same image, like the same, not the exact same image, but the same symbol of the stag with the cross in the middle. And apparently, I think it's Saint Eustace. There's two different Catholic saints that had the same vision of a deer with the cross in the antlers, and it's also stolen from the liquor Jägermeister.
Ah,
They have that on the bottle, so it's a combination of those things. But it doesn't mean much aside from I just think it's a cool symbol.
yeah, that's interesting. Um, So you write a lot about Spangler. You've also written about McLuhan and about Machiavelli. I'm constantly going through Machiavelli. I've read a little bit of Spangler. And, you are also somebody who kind of recognizes Plato. Kind of how do you are you I don't know if this term is popular in the way that I'm going to use it, but are you kind of are you coming at things from like I'm a Catholic and then I look back at philosophy through a Catholic lens? Do you sort of see that ancient philosophy kind of leads to? If I am I even right to call you a Catholic based off the iconography? Kind of
Yes,
where are you starting? Where are you going with that?
yeah. So I am Catholic, but that's not really that doesn't play a huge role in my writing. I mean, here and there, I'll kind of discuss some parables or Catholics from Catholicism if they come up or if they serve the argument. But I always kind of try to use it more as like a something allegorically useful, um, because I'm not writing a religion blog. There's a lot of there's a strong history of philosophy in the Catholic tradition, which I don't really write about that either, um, but it's more so that I'm writing about whatever I really think is interesting at the time. So if I got like really into a phase of, looking into Catholic philosophy, there is one Catholic thinker that I've actually been reading up a lot that I haven't seen much written about that I'm thinking of doing some stuff on him. But it's going to fit with stuff I'm already doing, specifically with the writings I've been doing on transhumanism. So yeah, so it's I'm not trying to convince people to become Catholic, although I think it's true. That's not really my project on Substack.
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to figure out like so with your essay. I really, by the way, I'll just say I like a lot. I don't know if you're generating these yourselves or finding them somewhere else, but you put a lot of sort of introductory pictures, and I'm of course they're AI generated, but some AI
Hmm.
pictures are better than others. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this artist Karel Willink. He's a Dutch. You could call him surrealist, magical realist, but he's really big into combining, among other things, he's big into combining ancient Greek and Roman architecture with kind of space age terrain and big landscapes, and kind of
Hmm.
combining brutalism together with like classical, neoclassical architecture. So I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but you might like him
No,
based
he's
off.
interesting. I'll have to go back and listen and get that name again.
Yeah, Carelwil. Same as Jocko Willink. So
Okay.
same last name. But yeah, so you have uh, you have an article on why it's bad to have value free uh, value free politics. Um, it's actually terrifying. Um, you reference Plato in that. Um, I mean, do you? the top comment is, I see your value free politics raise you value free ethics. So what is it even like?
Yeah.
Is such a thing? I mean, are people kidding themselves when and again, I have my own interpretation of Machiavelli. I can respond once you establish your position. But who are these people who are claiming to have a value free politics? Is such a thing possible? Um, Explore that a little.
Yeah, so I think that maybe this is my fault for not being completely clear because I didn't really mean to condemn it. In the last paragraph, I kind of talk about how it's terrifying to break through these myths because it's the myths that we rely on, but breaking through them also opens up the domain to new political possibilities. So something I've been toying with a lot in some of my essays, including this one, because I feel like I'm always just like uncovering more of a topic as I write about it, and I'm just kind of putting out bit by bit as I'm thinking about these things. But I've been toying with the idea of like the relationship between myth and reality, and like myth as social technology. Um, and so I do think value free politics are possible, but I think that it's very difficult for any sort of regime to try to actually just institute value free politics because I think they need some sort of founding myth, some fundamental justification for their rule that needs to have a mythic quality because the myth operates as a heuristic to justify their rule. So I do think value-free politics are possible. I think Machiavelli and a lot of the people that are seen in the Machiavellian tradition are value-free political thinkers to some degree or another. People getting at politics as a science, which I think that's extremely useful and extremely helpful. But the risk is like kind of the same risk as I kind of see it as like the Chesterton's fence risk. Like once you're kind of breaking through the mythic structure, you are opening the door for maybe bad things to come in, um, or unintended consequences. Because as I talk about in the essay, if you're just looking at politics as a science and trying to understand how all the dynamics work, that means you're going to both explore like how to rule in the best way possible and how to rule in the worst way possible. Whereas if you had stayed within the mythic system as a social technology that had evolved over a few generations or a few hundred years that had kind of optimized for specific aims, then once you do away with that and start to just lay out clear paths for different directions, it could serve or it could allow opportunists to, uh, you know, introduce tyranny or something like that.
We might have a semantic disagreement. So I don't think Machiavelli was value free, and I guess I would even step back further, right? The idea that he was a political scientist, I'd sort of dispute that science is value free. I think science attempts to be objective, meaning that it is attempting to universalize and escape a particular perspective. So rather than a nominalist view where every event is radically independent and has to be taken on its own terms phenomenologically, which is the tendency of a lot of continental philosophers, is they say, well, we've disenchanted the world through science. We've removed the sacredness from the moment to moment experience of life because we've over categorized things. But I think that itself, and Nietzsche identifies this, that's not the absence of a value. That is still a will to power expressed through the will to truth. It is the concept of a universal perspective. An objective perspective is not a value free perspective. So when you read Machiavelli and you try to understand what are his values, where he's coming from, he's very anti-tyranny. He's anti-monarchy. He's against the Catholic Church. He's a nationalist. He wants a revival of Italy. He ultimately sees some form of imperialism or expansion as a necessary part of a healthy state. He sees the concept of a limited city-state as kind of inherently corrupting. So I think there's a lot of values there. I think there's a lot of prescriptions. Now he is trying to get, he says there is a objective human nature, and we can compare Roman times to modern times to 100 years ago. We can compare all of these periods and find patterns because there is this truth that's transcendent beyond even particular religions. And he actually, one of the passages I was reading today, he says that, he basically predicts Nietzsche, or I think Nietzsche's like stealing from him in the respect that he says Christianity is a weak religion and that it discards the material world and it encourages. He really comes 99% of the way to just saying it's a slave morality. He says it's the morality that promotes a suffering attitude. It leads to slavery. It leads to tyranny because when you have people who only believe in the material world, then they're willing to fight a lot harder to maintain their liberties than if they believe they're going to be liberated through salvation in heaven and the afterlife. So he makes some pretty strong arguments there that are, you could even say, anti-Christian, and he's actually really arguing for a reformation of Christianity along neo-pagan lines. And so there is this aspect. It's a very Platonic idea, right? Plato is saying very much the same thing in the Republic, that we have this religion. It's clearly corrupt. There's something wrong with it, and we need to kind of infiltrate or subvert and rewrite these myths so that they can be healthy again, so that they can, approach the good. So both Plato and Machiavelli and Aristotle and these people who are philosophers, but I would say they're kind of writing from the position that there is an objective good, there is an objective truth that we're working toward. But a lot of the mythology of the present day, whether it's the time of Plato or the time of Machiavelli, a lot of the mythology is false. And so we need to be able to cut through that and, those sort of axiomatic, quote unquote, truths, those dogmatic truths have to be done away with. So to that extent, yeah, they are tearing down, you could say, certain subjectivities. But I guess I don't think they are at all value free. I think they are fanatical enough about their deep values that they're able to discard these masks or these pretenses about, oh, well, the church or the established religion is good in itself. They're like, no, there is this deeper level of truth and goodness that we have to get through. And in order to get there, we're going to have to kind of discard the things on the surface. But I don't think you can actually get to, I don't think you can do science without a love of science and a value of science. I don't know if I think maybe we might even agree on this point. It might just kind of be a semantic disagreement.
Yeah, I do think it was a semantic disagreement, because when I say value free, I don't necessarily mean that the person discussing the subject has no values. I mean more so that they're talking about it positively rather than normatively. That's what I was kind of trying to get at, which which is kind of getting to that deeper level of truth as you describe, getting to the essence of things rather than just kind of the subjective manifestations of things. But and this is a tension that I haven't resolved in my own thinking of if that's even a good thing to do necessarily. Because when I was reading, I did an essay on Euthyphro or Euthyphro last week, I think. But as I was reading it, what popped out to me about that wasn't even the Euthyphro dilemma that everybody talks about. It was more so that, okay, this guy has this conception of piety. Euthyphro understands piety on a level of action because he is behaving piously, and Socrates recommends that and Socrates commends that and recognizes that and never doubts that. But his issue is that Euthyphro won't give him a definition of piety. He can't get down to the essence of it, and rather keeps bringing up examples and ends up going in circles and looking at religious understandings of it. So I think the risk of, which I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing to do, but the risk of trying to get down to the essence of things and describe things completely objectively is that you can fall into this pit of over rationalization or just getting stuck in rationalism and not being able to devise values out of that. So, um, which I think goes along with what you're saying about science very well, because I think it's important to with something like science or economics or any domain like that that tries to be objective, you kind of have to bring in something from the outside to provide justification for it in the first place. Like you can't tell yourself like you can't scientifically prove the reason you are doing science. You do have to bring in values from the outside.
Yeah, well, there's a sometimes a process of deception or hiding the original intent, and there are many layers through which that is done. Although I would say in our present day, you look at these bioethicists and the amount of power that they wield. I mean, not just them, but any kind of moral regulation. That the idea that ethics ethics really dominates science in a very obvious way. If you're, and I think that kind of proceeds from a lot of science fiction, The Terminator, I, Robot, all of this fear about AI. I think Nick Bostrom is, I don't know if it was super intelligence or the idea of the gray goo or the paperclip machine and this apocalypse as a result of runaway technology. Elon Musk, even
Mhm.
despite the fact that he, is engaged in putting brain chips in people's brains, he's still saying, "Well, I'm afraid of AI. Could have this catastrophe. Could destroy civilization." Um, that kind of. So I think there's a way in which that is warranted, but not honestly. The way in which it's warranted is absolutely technology and science are kind of one and the same in this respect, in that they destroy masks, they destroy myths, they destroy power structures, they destroy religions. And as a result, if you're at the top of that power structure, that's threatening to you. Now, in terms of the sum total of humanity or the value of humanity or the good, it's not exactly apparent that the destruction of a particular power structure is overall bad. But that is the implication, that if there's if AI kind of shakes things up, or any technology, any scientific discovery shakes things up, that's going to be dangerous. The question is for whom? Obviously it's dangerous for any existing power structure. Desires stasis, it desires continuance. Like if you're at the top, you want to limit social mobility as much as possible. Um, and so there's like that conservative impulse there that is threatened by any sort of change. And yeah, so I think that there's a there is a conflation of change, inherently, the danger to the social structure that's inherently kind of bad for everyone. And maybe an example we can go into, you talk about falling birth rates. Now this I'm not sure what your position is on this exactly, because you also seem to praise like J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin. Although Nick Land maybe kind of is more in favor of the depopulation thing. But, there certainly has been this, at least from Elon Musk as another maybe part of that group, this pronatalist push, and the idea that if we don't have a continuous inflow of new workers to support what is effectively a gerontocracy, to support a non-working class, a retired class of elderly people. If we don't have that, then the system's just going to collapse. There's going to be, total chaos, and the economic system's going to break apart. And that's true. Again, if you're from looking at it from the position of maybe total GDP, or you're looking at it from the position of, I'm going to be in a retirement home, and so I need people to take care of me, and so on. But again, to conflate that then with like an absolute good in a universal sense is a bit of a jump. So yeah,
Yeah,
how do you kind of reconcile that? Do you think JD Vance is joking when he talks about natalism, or do you think that's just popular politics? Do you think you have
yeah,
a disagreement with him? How do you square that?
I understand the impulse, but I think overall I have a disagreement with a lot of the pundits that are talking about, the birth rates are declining. This is a really bad thing. Um, and this essay was actually inspired by Nick Land because he has a few very short essays on Malthus where he references a few people and he's like, I'm going to write more about this. And then he didn't write more about it. So it's like, okay, I'm going to follow these threads and see what else is going on here. And I got into neo-Malthusianism, but I think like the real kind of neo-Malthusianism, because a lot of people think population bomb, Ehrlich, yeah, Paul Ehrlich, that like, okay, the collapse is just around the corner. Whereas I don't think that's the best kind of neo-Malthusianism to look at. And there have been better scholars that have written on the issue. The two which I hone in are Gregory Clark. I think that's his first name. His last name is definitely Clark, and Volkmar Weiss or Weiss Volkmar. It's one or the other. They're both in the citations in that piece. If anybody's interested and wants to double check on those names, um, but this piece was really kicked off by a disagreement I had with somebody in a group chat in which I was saying that I think that even despite falling birth rates, we could have economic growth. And this guy was like, no, like population has to be growing for there to be economic growth. And that just kind of struck me as wrong. I didn't really think that was the right way of looking at things. And when you think about it on a very basic level, like if you want to measure standard of living, you're going to be looking at GDP per capita rather than GDP as a whole. And like all other things being equal, as the population number goes down, GDP per capita is rising. So on kind of a very basic level, that idea that okay, economic well-being needs rising population levels uh, is just wrong. Um, what's actually more of an aberration is that for the first time in human history since the Industrial Revolution, we are having a rise in prosperity along with a rise in population levels, thanks to like that we've been able to break out of the Malthusian trap, essentially. Um, so there's a couple different issues I raised in this, and I have like I think like five or six different conclusions at the bottom of the piece that kind of just like popped out of it. But it's like falling birth rates are bad for the social security state. Like that is going to collapse, and it's going to collapse faster if birth rates implode. But we can't keep the pyramid scheme going forever. Like, what are we supposed to have? Like 20 billion people to keep the social security state running? Like, I don't think that's going to work. So it's either going to need to undergo very serious reforms, or it's going to just have to go away entirely, and that's not going to be a pretty process. But one of my concerns with the issue is that okay, if you think that your population number has to be rising, then the population numbers are going down because your people domestically are not having children, then a lot of people are immediately jumping to okay, we need mass migration to fix the issue, which I have issues with mass migration that I didn't go over directly in this piece, but I think that's a bad thing, and that is actually counterproductive um, for the health of a nation overall. So I was saying that you know even if birth rates are going down, like you shouldn't plaster over it with this issue, because I don't think that um, aside from some economic binds that we have put ourselves in, falling birth rates are not a catastrophe or an apocalypse. So the title is supposed to be very attention grabbing. Uh, but overall, I think that falling birth rates are mostly a nothing burger and don't really need to be worried about, which that does put me against people like Elon Musk and JD Vance and, people who I admire on a lot of other issues, but I disagree with them on that.
Another thing that I feel like you're bucking the right wing trend here is with technology. Although I guess you agree with Elon Musk here. So I've encountered people on the right who are sort of pro technology and Neuralink and things of that nature, but they typically tend not to be Christians. They tend to say, "Well, on the right because of immigration. I'm on the right because of transgender issues or something else. But ultimately, I think it's good that we apply technology to human biology. How do you, especially with regard to cognition, consciousness, the soul? Um, Most Christians I talk to have a default position that God made us as well as we could be made. Now, um, obviously, the Christian position is where human nature is fallen and needs to be restored with Christ, but they typically view technology as kind of an idol or a false god. That if you try to improve human biology or human nature through technology, this is satanic. You're kind of running around God. You like found a loophole around salvation, and you're trying to. What you should really be focused on is trying to perfect humanity in the next life, in the world to come. Put your treasure in the world to come, not in the world as it is. And so they would reject a lot of transhumanism as a false god and as a anti-Christian idea, as a materialist. Now, one way to view that is basically say that Christianity is sort of agreeing with Gnosticism in this respect. Maybe not. You don't need to take that to the extreme that like, oh well, we need to now get rid of all healthcare. Although I actually kind of have argued that position. I said if you are truly a Christian and you truly believe you're created by God and God has a plan for you, he decides when you die, etc., then there is no reason at all to get radiation therapy for cancer or to support other people doing that, because God ends our lives precisely when he means to, and any attempt on our part to extend our lives beyond that natural point of what's prescribed in the Bible, which is eating food, drinking water, exercising maybe. But anything beyond that is kind of subversive. So I actually, in my mind, that is an authentic, logically consistent Christian position. But you have a different position, perhaps. So can you kind of justify that to me?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with your assessment of like a Christian who just thinks like, okay, any technology that impacts our lives, or like prolongs our lives is bad. It's like, okay, yeah, that followed to its logical extreme is like, okay, don't get medical care then. Because I think that like a lot of people understand transhumanism as, okay, that's when technology is connected to the body physically. That's when you get a brain chip or something like that. But there's an issue with that view. Like, what about a prosthetic limb? It's like, okay, well, maybe not that. What about a prosthetic limb that, or like, what about Stephen Hawking's wheelchair where you can like kind of blow into the tube to make it go forward or backward? Or I don't know if he had that, but some people have that kind of wheelchair, where it's like, okay, it's not like literally attached to your body, but it might as well be because you can't exist independently of it. Or let's say phones, like, because I I think that a lot of Christians get caught up in thinking in very Cartesian dualist terms of thinking, okay, the mind and the body are two separate, completely distinct things that have no relation to one another. But I think that if something is attached to your mind, in a way, it's much more attached to your body, or it's much more attached to you. And in my transhumanism essay, I bring up the example of phones, where we, by the standard that, okay, transhumanism is when technology is attached to a person, we are all already transhuman. And I think there's an argument to be made for that because our phones are attached to us. Like, it might as well be physically attached to us. Very few people go anywhere without their phones. And I brought in Schopenhauer into that essay because he talks about how mental pain is much harder to get rid of than physical pain. Mental pain sticks in much deeper because I think the connections in the mind, connections to the mind, connections to your psychology are stronger than connections to your biology. That's why you can't have a surgery to get rid of a mental illness, but a physical illness you can treat with a certain regimen of medicine and it will go away. So in a way, I think that that the attachment we have to our phones is a much deeper connection than something like Neuralink would be. Like, sure, Neuralink is literally plugged into your physical brain, but you can just have a procedure and take that out, and then it's just gone. But you have your phone on you all the time, and even if you leave it, it's going to take a while until that kind of that those pings that draw you back to it over and over and over again are going to go away. That's probably going to take a couple days, whereas the surgery to take Neuralink out is only going to take maybe a couple hours. Um, so I don't think that that's the division that we should look at. What from a Christian or non-Christian perspective, even if you're going to take some other perspective, I don't think that's the line on which we should be evaluating transhumanism. Instead, I think we should look at what what helps human dignity, like what technology that in technology in favor and that enriches human dignity, and technology that erodes human dignity. And I kind of just use human dignity as a given in that piece, and I don't really dive into it because then that really spirals out of control as an essay. Um, but but I think enough people have kind of a sense of what I was talking about there to where that wasn't as big of a deal. Um, but you could get really granular about it, which I didn't want to, because okay, a Catholic perception of human dignity is going to be different than a Protestant one, different than an atheist one, especially when you're looking at technological subjects. But I think that's generally the fault line on which we should divide our perspective on intermingling technology with the human being. And I think it's also unwise to just say technology is anything with electricity or something like that, because that's really not the case. Uh, I come from a very media theoretical background, and I've spent a lot of time with McLuhan, as well as like Jacques Ellul and Ted Kaczynski, and like very anti-tech thinkers. And I think they have a lot of interesting stuff to say, and I think their analysis of technology is good. Um, but also Spengler discusses technology and man and technics, and I really like the way he describes technology, or what he says is technics. Technics is not just like if you talk about a hammer, technics is not just the tool of the hammer itself. Technics is the tool along with the mental process that uses the tool. Like hammering is the technics. A hammer just by itself, like who cares? It's the hammering that is the technics. Um, so technology and technics exists in a litany of ways that it's not electronics. I think money is a technology. I think language is a technology. Books are a technology. Writing is a technology. And these are all technologies that have become extremely intertwined with the human being and the way that we exist. Like you can just look at the way that language shapes the way people think. And you're a philosophy guy. Like you can kind of tell that philosophers from different languages, like French versus German thinkers, you can kind of just get a sense that they're thinking in a different way. Part of that is because of the language they speak. So that's why I have an issue with just saying, okay, technology intermingling with the human being is a bad thing, because that's you can't really make that position consistent without saying we should just behave like apes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I mean, sure, there are people, there are like Christian anarcho-primitivists or something like that. I don't want, I'm not trying to press you
Mm-hmm.
or kind of like question your faith. But I do, I can't help but notice that you're really into these like non-Christian and sometimes anti-Christian authors. You write about Peter Thiel not caring that he's gay, not caring that he's not just like a repentant gay man, but
Mm-hmm.
he donates to pro-gay organizations. Um, I'm kind of like, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, for a lot of Christians, for example, when it comes to sexuality, um, homosexuality is just not a topic that's really hammered on anymore the way it was 10, 20 years ago. And so now the thing is, transgender surgery. The idea is that, God made us with genitalia, and if you mutilate the body, despite the fact that circumcision is prescribed. But this type of mutilation, like you could remove a little bit of the genitalia, but too much, and then that's a totally different qualitative thing, because you've interrupted the reproductive function, which God told us to be fruitful and multiply. Although he also told us that some make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. So I mean, maybe there's some arguments that to be made there, but in general, the ideas like reproduction. I think Alan Keyes made this argument, like, in principle, reproduction is the defining characteristic of male and female, and once you start messing around with that, you are defying God's plan and you're defying God's vision. So that's, I think, one that Christians have really focused on, although I don't actually, again, I don't see that as like a more convincing argument philosophically. I think viscerally, the idea of mutilating the body or changing the body or something like that is more offensive to people in a visceral way, in like a body horror type of way, than homosexuality. I think most people, if they do have a negative conception of what it entails, it's sort of easier to not think about it. It's easier not to get into the visceral details of that. And I suppose on some level you could consider all sexuality to be kind of, I mean, and again, New Testament does say celibacy would be optimal, but because you guys are all sinners, I'm going to let you be monogamous. I'm going to let you have marriage. So, yeah, I mean, you talked about that Cartesian duality. I think that's an important component here, where the flesh is again and again called out as a negative force, and the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So there's that clear dichotomy. And so, I mean, yeah, on that issue, and I see that as kind of connected. Like, how do you justify? Do you think people are interpreting the Bible incorrectly or something? Sodom and Gomorrah is more about being polite to guests than it is about sodomy. Like, how do you look at non-Christian authors, thinkers, writers, Spangler, Peter Thiel, whatever, and there are these kind of violations of Christian norms? Do you say, well, it's not as big of a violation as people think, or we're all sinners, or it's all kind of, we can find inspiration from the pagan philosophers. It doesn't matter whether someone's Christian or not as to whether what they're saying is true or false. Christianity only determines the destiny of your soul. It doesn't determine the clarity of your cognition. Because faith is totally radically separate from rationality. Someone could be super intelligent, super rational in all sorts of ways, and yet never become a Christian, because no amount of rationality and reason will ever lead you to Christianity. It's this inevitable, almost like a Calvinist, like totally nominalistic, there's this, just the Holy Spirit either descends on you or it doesn't. And therefore, we don't have to discriminate against non-Christians or people who engage in homosexual acts, because that has nothing to do with their philosophical quality. And we can kind of fraternize with them philosophically. We can learn from them philosophically. We can have philosophical communion despite the fact that they're not going to be in the body of Christ. They're not going to be, they're not going to heaven. So I guess, can you kind of like explain the connection, reason, faith, theology there? How do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, I really don't mind being pressed on my beliefs. And I think that's why I am interested in a lot of non-Christian authors, and why I write about more non-Christian authors than I do Christian authors. I don't know if I've really written about that many Christian authors or thinkers. But regardless, I mean, like, somebody can be wrong about some things and right about other things, and somebody can be wrong about a lot of things, but still have interesting things to say, and, be interesting to understand and make me think about things and to challenge my own perspective more, and that's why, like, as a Catholic, I am really enjoying reading Schopenhauer. Like, I think he's such a clear writer and a lot of fun to read, and his understanding of the world is very interesting. And it's like, like and like I don't know if I agree or disagree on all of that. It's because I think that, figuring out if you like fully agree or fully disagree on a philosopher with something is like that takes a lot of work. And it's like we can kind of get these inclinations that it's like, yeah, this is what I think about this. But to actually be like, okay, now I can with surety outright reject Schopenhauer, like it's going to take like 10 years before I can say that from like just the basis of like having studied enough and, um, you know, and construct like a rational argument that like debunks him or something like that, and I think that's, being young, and I think we're both relatively young. It's we've only had so much time here to kind of figure stuff out, so we are going to have to take shortcuts, especially as we dive into new authors and people that challenge our perspectives. um, and that's part of the reason why I've been writing so much about myth and narrative as critical components of like human understanding, because I think that those shortcuts are necessary. And my first essay on this issue was called "Reckoning with Truth and Myth." That in that essay, the essay was kind of born out of this tension of like, okay, there's all these philosophers, and like I've got this massive bookshelf here with all this philosophy on it, and like how, like even if I read one of them and take the time to fully understand it, like I, just set aside all the time in the world to like make sure I really get what Heidegger is saying. It's like, okay, now, like how does what Heidegger says in a like how is that challenged from Aristotle's perspective or Schopenhauer's perspective or Hegel's perspective or Nietzsche's perspective or the Catholic perspective? And it's like understanding all those challenges and then like being able to deliberately understand how everything relates with one another and, definitively say like, okay, Heidegger has a point over Nietzsche here and he has a point over Catholicism here, but Schopenhauer's a point over him here. So it's like, you gotta take shortcuts at some point and just kind of do your best to understand the concepts. And for me, like learning and understanding philosophy is a lifelong journey that I don't expect to have all the answers anytime soon. And I'm more so just trying to just even take the pieces out of the box right now, so to speak, before I try to fit them all together, which, it's like, hey, those two puzzle pieces do go together, and I can see that right now, but I'm still a long way from having the whole puzzle piece together. So um, I hope that's a clear enough answer to your question. That but that kind of gets at why I think some degree of faith is necessary. It's just because like understanding everything, period, is really really hard, and you need to take shortcuts. And understanding everything, period, is impossible, probably.
Right. So I guess I would agree with you that if you look at any individual thinker, it's impossible. I mean, just taking people as individuals, it would be impossible to scrutinize all of somebody else's beliefs and determine exactly whether or not they're true or whether you agree with them. And maybe even more pessimistically, I think it's impossible, or there's an argument to be made that we cannot thoroughly investigate all of our own beliefs, even if we could maybe investigate all of the big ones and get the big ones right. Although I don't see any reason why it should be easier to figure out the nature of God than it should be to figure out, who's going to win the next election or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not immediately impaired. I mean, I guess like doctrine of divine simplicity or something, you could say that rational truths are more readily accessible to the human mind than empirical truths. That when we're dealing with billions of people and large data, that those things maybe are unknowable because there's just too much going on for us to compute or to analyze. We don't have the computational power to figure those things out, but we can figure out essential truths like there is a creator and he incarnated on earth or something. Like we can figure that out intuitively. But I mean, I guess so my question would be like, why is it that you can look at an individual and say, well, I agree with some, I disagree with others, but then you're going to look at, and maybe maybe you don't, maybe you're heterodox, but how can you look at the Catholic Church and just say, like, I have faith in this institution that all of its dogma is correct? I'm not a priest, I'm not a theologian, I don't have time. I mean, I figure wherever you are at now in your journey, at some point you decided I am a Catholic, and certainly, um, you didn't know everything about the church then. You didn't have time to go through all the dogmas and like prove them.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I guess is that for you? Do you attempt to justify that faith? Is that faith something that you feel called toward, or you were born into it and it's the tradition of your ancestors and that's what you're continuing with? Do you just kind of take it as a granted of this is like an axiomatic, this is my rock in life and I'm building upon this? And if people disagree with it or there's contradictions, like we'll figure it out eventually. But ultimately, I just have faith that kind of in the end, it's all going to be reconcilable with Catholicism. Um, do you feel like it's a decision, or do you feel like it's just a given fact of your life?
Yeah, I like the way you conduct interviews and how you kind of like give like multiple choice answers that are like very open ended, because it's like it's a lot of those things that you just said, are because I do like reading up on, um, I've been studying not a ton. I lost the book I was reading, but I've been studying up on the some cosmology from a Catholic priest. I really wish I could find that book. You just reminded me it was missing. Um, but yeah, it's I did choose to become Catholic about 3 years ago, and it's like you it's unrealistic to expect somebody to, okay, let's like go through all the dogmas and like figure it out. But at the same time, like that's not even the only question you have if you're going to go at it from that perspective, because um, you also have to say, okay, these are all absolutely true, and then you have to go through all the other religions and say those are absolutely false, or something like that, or be able to confidently disprove every aspect of every other system of faith if you're going to take that rationalistic perspective. So, but that's kind of the nature of faith, is like you kind of have to make a leap of faith. You kind of have to you have to choose something. You have to choose some shortcut for how you're going to have your basic understanding of the world operate. And then you're going to have to investigate that further. And there's always going to be more questions about it, like a little kid does, like, why? And it's like, you kind of got to explain to the kid that there's not really ever going to be any end to this. And you kind of have to stop at some point. And, but then as you grow up, you don't stop at some point, and you do have to keep asking why, and you do have to keep diving deeper into these questions. So it's, in a lot of ways, it's um, okay, yeah, this is the faith of my ancestors. Like I'm not my direct ancestors, but I go a few generations back, and it's like, okay, yeah, there are the European Catholics in my ancestry. So that that's a part of it, but that's not the main reason I'm Catholic. It's more so because um, I've chosen to put my faith in this one specific rock, like you said, and I'm kind of going to build out from there. Um, and like that doesn't mean I'm going to like make sure that everything I'm reading and enjoying is like passing, is like getting green lights on all the priors I have for my Catholicism. I'm more interested in understanding someone like Nietzsche on his own terms, and then evaluating him after I've understood him on his own terms, rather than saying like, well, he said God is dead, but God's not dead. That movie said so. So you know, gonna stop reading Nietzsche now. It's like, uh, but at the same time, reading people who have contradictory opinions to my faith challenges my faith, and allows me to really ask myself those hard questions of like, okay, why do why do I believe what I believe? And like, okay, like this idea of like Christianity being a slave morality and like producing these outcomes. It's like, okay, what do I think about that? I gotta work on that. So yeah, and I feel like the this kind of idea that I'm getting out of like faith being some sort of like choosing to have faith in something and allowing yourself to be governed by some mythic understanding of the world is necessary. Yeah, I think that's my thesis. Like that's just a necessary way of doing things. Um, and I think that that's regardless of the faith you have. Like I think even if you're an atheist, like I think you just kind of have to have that perspective.
I agree. I think that the attempt to separate mythology from language is arbitrary. So, you know, one one person's scientific fact. I mean, it's a narrative, right? It's a series of symbols that at some point you do run up into this problem that what is this empirical reality that we're describing with language? Is language a one-to-one accurate description of reality, or is it an approximation? Is it a heuristic? Is it something that correlates but gets things wrong? Um, it's really difficult. I mean, unless like if you're very naive and you're not able to understand language outside of itself. Like you said, you look at different philosophers who write in different languages. If you're not able to conceive of the possibility of there being such a thing as different languages, then I suppose you can just have the naive perspective of, you're kind of a fish in water, and you're not able to perceive the way that language warps or structures your reality. And even without language, we have a perceptual apparatus. We can see we watch, you put the straw in the cup of water. It looks like the straw is bent. It's not actually bent. It's an optical illusion. So we see the way in which we're receiving sense data around the world, whether, through hallucination or through illusion or whatever. We see that there's not a direct correspondence between the reality out there and our perception. We are subjects, and our perception is subjective. We're not just kind of naively, oh, the earth is flat because it looks pretty flat to me. Okay, well, most of us can see that there's something wrong there, and we're not capable of naively just trusting in our senses. The world's too complicated. I mean, human beings are too complicated. We have to assume a theory of mind about other people. We have to assume other people's intentions. We have to assume that the stranger on the subway is not going to take out a knife and stab me and that's what kind of a neurotic, mentally ill person thinks, is they're in a constant state of fear and panic arbitrarily, or from our perspective arbitrarily, in a way that's not functional. So first and foremost, I believe in evolution. I think we are oriented towards survival. There is a selective process that keeps that, pressure on us. If there was no selective pressure, then in a pure abstract simulation, you could imagine all sorts of different patterns of thinking. You could imagine forms of consciousness or personality or perception that just don't correspond to reality, or correspond in really weird ways. Like the scale and the scope of our perception is suited to the scale and scope of our bodies. So we can't see, like a bacteria is able to perceive light within, a 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter or something, because that's the perceptual, an insect or something is focused on things the size of an insect. We can use a microscope or whatever to scale down. We can use a telescope, something to scale up. But yeah, we're our sense of time. If you're a mosquito or something, your entire sense of time is different. And supposedly, I guess if we ascribe like consciousness to a tree, okay, the tree is going to have a different sense of time. And actually, plants do have reaction time. if you cut a plant, it reacts to that.
Mhm.
It heals itself.
And people at different ages have different senses of time. Like if you're a very small child, time goes very quickly. But as you get older, and I know everybody listening knows this. You know, as you get older, time starts to slow down. So, but I think it's a mistake that we make in just doing philosophy or starting or like being very interested in philosophy is that we think that thinking is the primary thing, that thinking is the very first thing. And we forget that there are these other things going on, like subconscious thinking that, you know, that I do think that we are biologically wired for, you know, that our bodies and the subconscious parts of our mind, the large part of our mind that isn't, you know, thinking the words in our head is doing a lot of stuff and computing a lot of stuff that isn't just like the conscious stream of thought that we're uh, doing. Um, you know, and we all have kind of those moments where something at a deeper level takes over. Like an example is like when you're driving home from work on the same route and you do it like every single day. Um, and then you're like, oh crap, there's my exit. I need to get over 4 lanes of traffic. And it's like, you really need to do it. So without even kind of thinking and identifying all the cars, like you're able to very quickly scan, okay, know where the cars are, and your muscle memory kind of takes over to know how to navigate 4 lanes over very quickly and weaving through all these cars in a way where if you thought about it, it would probably go slower and you would probably crash. um, you know uh, and then there's also the domain of action, which is like you said, like the very neurotic person is kind of crumbles because they are thinking about everything and are asking all these questions all the time. You know, they're the if somebody is, which is maybe the perfect philosopher is somebody that's constantly questioning everything. But then you're entirely stuck and you can't do anything. But humans must act. Like we have to act to survive. We have to do something, you know, and we get to think, but that's not the primary thing for our survival. There's those deeper biological aspects dealing with things, but you know, thinking is more suited towards uh, thinking allowed us to introduce complexity into the whole situation and have these big societies. And it's also, I think it's more suited towards like trying to reach towards some sort of transcendent reality, transcendent truths of some kind. But I think we make a mistake in thinking that thinking is, you know, the first and primary thing. Um, which how can we not if we're thinking about it? Because thinking is like our priority to thinking at all. But it's not all that's going on.
Yeah. Is there some kind of I guess we're reaching the end of our hour here. Um, Maybe a final question for you, and then I'll let you have the last word. Is if you're identifying, like you're saying, you know, there the human being experiences the world and makes decisions, moral decisions, like right or wrong, good or bad. We make decisions not just based on thinking, but based on some like deeper subconscious process, something within us, maybe the Holy Spirit, maybe our biology, ancestral memory. Um, there is a kind of a Thomist tradition or rationalist tradition in Christianity, which would say that Christianity can be arrived at through like a series of syllogisms, and this is kind of the path. You know, Christ is the logos, and that means being very logical. And so, like, if you reach peak, you know, as you approach the mind of God, you're going to approach the truth, and so on. Do you think that there's an alternative to that? Do you think, I mean, and maybe it's not an answerable question, because if we can't think about it, then how could we describe it with language? But do you think that there is there are other methods or there are other mechanisms that are bringing to God? I mean, maybe necessary. And I think that is basically the Calvinist position in a way. Just like there's a lot of contradictory theological positions here. So I'm kind of, you know, I'm asking a leading question maybe, and I've got to say like, is, or maybe your personal theology is well, maybe it does accord with the Catholic tradition over the Calvinist tradition or something like that. But um, yeah, I'm kind of asking as an outsider how you think that mechanism works, and yeah, how that I'll just kind of leave that as the last one, maybe a mysterious question, and then I'll give you the last word as we wrap up here.
Yeah. So I don't think that we can't think about these things. I think that there's this book called The Master and His Emissary that's about the two hemispheres of the brain that I forget the name of the author, but maybe I'll comment it below or I'll DM it to you and you can put it in the notes or something. But it's about the left brain versus the right brain. And he talks about how um, they only one side of your brain is like that conscious train of thought. And there's been a lot of studies on people with split brains where one side's been chopped off from the other. And they're doing things that they're not consciously thinking of. Like one side of their brain is acting independently of their consciousness. And like it's and I don't know all the details or I don't have them all in my mind right now. Um, but but that goes to show that we can think about these things, just because thinking is what we're doing when we're thinking doesn't mean we can't think about non-thinking things. Because I mean, there's evolutionary psychology and that exists, and I there's and there probably is some degree of the like evolutionary psychological conditioning in our subconscious, and maybe some of the Holy Spirit too governing us, or maybe some sort of divine spark. Um, and yeah, I do think that like maybe you can get to the fundamental truths about divinity and religion from Thomistic proofs and like rationalizing it down all the way. Um, but not everybody has time to do that, and not everybody has the brain power to do that and to like hold that at the front of their mind at all times, or something like that. So but I don't think that you I don't think that you necessarily have to come to faith through reason alone, um, because a lot of people, I think most people that like go from not being Christian to being Christian or like decide to come back to Christianity, don't do it because like okay, finally the arguments have convinced me. It's they have some like moment of awe and reality or something like that, like you know and like this isn't my experience, but like people describing like just like seeing the beauty of nature and like recognizing like oh there has to be a creator in this, or like what Einstein said about like he saw the mark of God on like every aspect of physics that he like looked into, and he was like this has to be like signed by somebody, so yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be arrived at rationally either. But I guess that's all I have to say on that subject. But this has been a very interesting conversation. I really appreciate you having me on here because I've had a ton of fun having this discussion.
Awesome. Um, yeah, let's follow up at some point. I'm sure you're pretty. You write a lot and you write very, very carefully. So I'm sure we'll have some things to talk about next time. But we're out of time for today. We'll leave it there, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye bye. All right, guys, like it, comment, and restack it. That's all the time we have for today. Take care. Bye bye.